Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to what is week number 7 of PPA 500. So we are almost there. Technically, our class ends next Monday at midnight with the submission of your final assessment. So the way things are looking is I think we'll have no problem at all getting through the remaining information in this Zoom session. So this will be our final Zoom session for the course. So your Canvas essay number 5, those that have been submitted as of about half an hour ago, I have reviewed those and provided feedback and a grade on those. And as always, the Canvas essays have really been very well done this term. So I'm very impressed with your work, very impressed with your critical thinking, with your writing skills. And so everyone's doing very well on those Canvas essays. If you have not submitted your Canvas essay number 5, along with responses to 2 classmates, please make sure to do that no later than midnight tonight. And then your final assignment is the final assessment that we covered in class last week. That is then due by midnight next Monday, March the 11th, and then our class ends at that point in time. So we're almost done. Tonight, what we're going to do is finish up the remainder of our material in this section that I like to call the functions of public administration. And so just kind of recap where we left off in class last week. Then we'll get into some of the discrete functions of how we manage human resources in the first half of class tonight. Then the second half of class, we'll get into some particulars in terms of how we manage fiscal resources, budgeting, and finance. Again, just kind of hit some of the highlights to get you ready then for your PPA 535 public budgeting course. And then I have a couple slides at the very end to kind of wrap everything up and talk about the future of public administration, and then get you ready to go on your way to be successful throughout the remainder of the MPA program. So that is our plan of attack for this evening. Again, so for next week, we won't have a live Zoom session next Monday. We'll just afford you that time to put the finishing touches on your final assessment. I will be available, though. I'm going to be around. So if you have any questions as you're finishing up your final assessment, just send me an email, and I will certainly be in front of my computer with access to my email between 4 and 6:45 next Monday in case you have any questions as you finish up your final assessment. But I think, as I told you before, the university really likes to have that final session be dedicated to the culminating experience for the course. And so that's why we kind of reserve that final Monday session for you to finish up your final assessment. So let's start out tonight just with a quick recap of where we left off last week as a segue then into the management of human resources, and kind of foreshadow some of the information that you'll be getting in your PPA 577 Human Resource Management course. So last week we talked about the development and evolution of civil service. We talked about the 3 main eras we went through in public employment: era of gentlemen from the founding of the nation up until 1820s, then the era of spoils, primarily with the election of Andrew Jackson in 1828, running up to 1883 and the passage of this Pendleton Act, which then ushered in this era of merit. We talked about then some of the changes that the Civil Service Reform Act made to our career civil service system in 1978, the creation of these different types of organizations. Then we also talked about the career civil service itself and position classification systems. We talked about the position classification system at the federal level, this thing we call the general schedule, or these GS levels to positions in the federal bureaucracy. I kind of walked you through all the different levels in the federal bureaucracy and some of the advantages and some of the disadvantages of having a position classification system. And then we also talked about the influence of unions and the impact that collective bargaining agreements have on the management of human resources. In that, as we manage human resources, we not only have to be concerned about civil service regulations, but we also have to be very concerned about the influence of the collective bargaining agreement and provisions that are incorporated within that collective bargaining agreement. And we identified that public employees are much more likely to belong to unions, to be unionized, than their private sector counterparts. And so collective bargaining and unionization oftentimes has an even more profound and outsized impact upon the management of human resources in the public sector. So in today's career civil service, what we have is we kind of have a hybrid system whereby the vast majority of our bureaucrats, vast majority of our public administrators are career civil servants who are afforded these protections under the under government code, these civil service protections against arbitrary and capricious dismissal, against the undue influence of politics in the way in which we treat these employees. So they have these career civil service protections. At the very top level of our agencies and departments, we have political appointees. These political appointees are exempt positions in that they are not part of the career civil service. They are appointed at the federal level by the president, and in some instances confirmed by the Senate. They oftentimes have a different approach to running an organization than our career civil servants. But today we kind of have that hybrid system where the vast majority of employees are career civil servants under an era of merit. But we do have the top cadre of leaders in our agencies and departments who are political appointees, kind of a throwback to the era of spoils, the era of patronage. So we kind of have that hybrid system in our system of career civil service today. So let's talk a bit about the management of human resources, and I'll take you through some of the functions that we engage in as we manage human resources in public organizations. And if you work in a public organization, if you deal at all with a public budget, as we have presented before, the lion's share of the money that's being spent in a public budget will be devoted to the management of human resources. Anywhere from 80 to 85 to 90% of most public budgets, though that's money that goes towards salaries and benefits for those human resources. So if 85 to 90% of your budget is going to management of human resources, it kind of signals to us just how important that function is for what we do as public administrators in our public organizations. So obviously, one of the first things we need to do in managing human resources is we need to engage in recruitment. We need to be able to go out there and recruit people to work in our agencies who have the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities in order to do the job. And there are some distinct differences between how we recruit people in the public versus the private sector. In the public sector, as we know, we have all these additional values that we are concerned about beyond just effectiveness and efficiency. We are very concerned about representative bureaucracy. We're very concerned about the protection of individual rights. We're very concerned about social justice and social equity. And as such, it means that we want to get the most diversified workforce we can possibly recruit. And so, in order to make our workforce as diverse as possible, we oftentimes engage in a lot more targeted recruitment in the public sector than you might do in the private sector. And I made a little adjustment to this slide a little bit ago just to add in some examples of some of the different targeted recruitment sources that we can use in doing targeted recruitment. And so whenever we are hiring for a position here in our department, we will do targeted recruitment, and we will place our ads and we'll reach out to targeted sources such as the local government Hispanic network, the American Society for Public Administration section for women in public administration, the National Forum for Black Political Scientists. There's also a National Forum for Black Public Administrators. And by advertising with these different outlets, we're better able to reach out to a more diverse. And that's something, again, we do a lot more in the public sector as compared to recruitment in the private sector. I think I've talked to you before about the way in which you do recruitment in the public sector is that you oftentimes need to have your vacancy announcements approved by an Office of Equity and Diversity, as we used to call it here at Cal State Long Beach. Those vacancy notices would then have to be approved by that Office of Equity and Diversity. Then the sources, the recruitment plan that we use must also be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity. So they will look to make sure we are using these diverse targeted types of recruitment sources. In addition to recruiting through these sources, when I was department chairman, whenever we would do a faculty hire, I would also write letters to chairs of PhD programs. If those PhD programs were known for granting a large percentage of the degrees to members from underrepresented populations. And so the American Society for Public Administration has a list of those organizations, those institutions. So I would tailor letters directly to those individual PhD programs to try and recruit people out of those PhD programs. Again, for the purpose of trying to enhance the diversity in our faculty, in our workforce. So in targeted recruitment, all these recruitment strategies must be very clear, they must be very well articulated, and they must be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity before you can go out there and start recruiting. As I also mentioned to you in a previous class, once you start getting those applications, that applicant pool then must also be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity, that it has enough diversity in that applicant pool before you can proceed. If your applicant pool does not have an adequate amount of diversity, then you'll have to scratch that recruitment and you'll have to then restart the process again, perhaps change your recruitment plan, perhaps look at different targeted recruitment sources, and go through the process again to try and create a much more diverse labor pool or applicant pool. So that applicant pool itself has to be reviewed for equity and diversity. Then once we move past the recruitment phase, we move into the selection phase where we're actually hiring people out of that applicant pool. We are still doing it under the auspices of the Office of Equity and Diversity. And we're still doing it to try and enhance the diversity of our workforce. So once our applicant pool has been approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity, then we can go through those applications. We can then narrow those applications down to a pool of semifinalists. That semifinalist pool then must again be approved to make sure that it has adequate diversity in the semifinalist pool. We then do interviews of those semifinalists, oftentimes phone or Zoom interviews, to then narrow it down to the list of the top 3, usually candidates, who will then be invited to an on-campus interview. That final applicant pool, those three finalists, must then also be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity. So diversity runs through not just recruitment, but also through the selection process. Now, in the public sector, as we had talked about last week, under the era of merit, under the Pendleton Act, the primary selection mechanism for people to be hired into the federal bureaucracy was the use of an examination. And the old exams that were used at the federal level were referred to as the PACE exams, the PACE, the PACE exams. And so you would sit for this examination, then the examination would then be scored. The top 3 or the top 5 scores on that examination would then be put onto an eligibility list. That eligibility list would then be transferred to the agency that was doing the hiring. Then the agency could only interview people off of that eligibility list. So if a candidate didn't score in the top 3 or the top 5, depending on how it was done, then that person could not then be interviewed. There's also a device that was used in examinations called veterans preference. And so if someone who takes that examination is a veteran and has served in the military, they will automatically have a certain number of points added on to their final score to raise their final score to, again, try and diversify our workforce to include veterans as well. So it's very much of a centralized top-down process that was run primarily through the Office of Personnel Management with the administration of these examinations, these PACE exams. Since then, since the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978, we have kind of decentralized the selection process. And so now, instead of having everything run by the Office of Personnel Management, now what we have done is we have decentralized the selection, the hiring process down to those individual agencies, those individual departments. So individual departments have a lot more control over who they interview and who they hire. We've also moved away from this exclusive use of examinations, and we have moved more toward a more holistic review of KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities. So we'll select people based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities as represented in their resume, as represented in their experience, their education, as represented by their references. Those are the types of things that we'll look at in much more of a subjective, holistic type of perspective, as opposed to using an examination. The problem with examinations is that oftentimes those examinations lacked validity. And there's a very famous case back from the 1970s called Griggs versus Duke Power Company that established the fact that in order for an examination to be used for hiring purposes, that examination must have what's called content validity, meaning that the content of the exam must track with the content of the position. So you can't hire someone for a custodial position, and in hiring them, you then give them an examination on quantum physics or something like that. The content of the exam must reflect the content of the job. That's what's known as content validity. We also found that a lot of these examinations, especially the PACE exam that was used at the federal level, really did lack a lot of validity in terms of uh, there was a lot of implicit bias that was built into the exams, a lot of cultural bias built into the exams. And so that cultural bias was making it more difficult for us to rely upon those exams as an accurate predictor of how well someone is going to do on the job. And I don't want to get too much into detail here because you'll talk about this when you get to human resource management, but a useful exam is an exam that not only has content validity, but also has what's referred to as predictive validity. And so predictive validity is kind of what it sounds like. An exam with predictive validity means that performance on that exam strongly correlates with performance on the job. That people who perform well on the exam will then perform well on the job. If that's the case, then we have predictive validity. So what we'll do is when we hire people, we'll then, after they work in the organization for some time, we'll then do a performance evaluation of their performance, and then we'll compare their performance evaluation on the job to how they scored on the exam. If there's a strong positive correlation, then that exam is said to have predictive validity. The opposite of predictive validity is what's known as criterion validity. And in criterion validity, you just kind of turn the process around. So in criterion validity, what we will do is we will, instead of looking at how well the exam predicts performance on the job, what we'll do is we'll take existing employees, people who are already working in the organization, and we'll then give them the exam. So they're already employed with the organization. We'll give them the exam. There are no punitive measures, so they're not going to get fired or anything like that for their performance. But we'll give existing employees the exam, and then we'll look at are those employees who are getting high performance evaluations, they also then score high on this exam. People who are getting low performance evaluations, they also score low on the exam. And that's an approach known as criterion validity. But in applying content validation, predictive validation, criterion validation, there are a lot of other validation methods you'll talk about in future courses. But in applying those, what we found is a lot of these examinations, especially the PACE exam at the federal level, they just lacked a lot of this validity. So if you're using an exam to predict how well someone's going to work on the job, and that exam is not accurately predicting how people work on the job, then obviously that exam is not something that you should be using. So that's why we have moved away from examinations and moved more toward holistic examination of knowledge, skills, and abilities. One other approach that you will probably talk about in 577 is the use of what are called assessment centers. An assessment center in the public sector is when an agency will bring in applicants, oftentimes on a Saturday morning, and will put them into a simulated work environment. They will then evaluate those applicants' performance in that simulated work environment, in that simulated assessment center. And then those who perform the best in this assessment center will then be the ones who get offered jobs in the organization. By doing that, you see how people actually do the work they're going to be doing on a daily basis. The disadvantage is obviously this is expensive and this is very time consuming to bring people in and set up these simulated assessment centers. It's a really resource intensive way to go about selection. The other problem goes back to our discussion of organization theory a couple of weeks ago in Elton Mayo. It's the Hawthorne effect. That when you watch people do something, if they know they are being watched, it's going to affect their productivity. They're going to work harder in these assessment centers because they want the job. And they're probably going to work harder and more efficiently in these assessment centers than perhaps they will work once they are hired to work in the organization. So there are, again, some validity issues along with expense issues associated with the use of these assessment centers. But today we base most of our assessment on assessment of knowledge, skills, and abilities, looking at the applicant's file, interviewing the applicant, checking the applicant's references. Those are more the modalities that we use in terms of hiring people to work in the public sector. Once you hire people into your organization, the public sector, you then need to allocate and evaluate the work within the organization. So this is where we kind of get a little detailed in the public sector in terms of how we go about the actual management of human resources within an organization. One of the first things that we will do in evaluation is this idea of job analysis. In a job analysis, we will look at each individual job within our organization, and we will deconstruct that job into its component elements. So oftentimes what we will do is we'll have the incumbent, the person who is working at a job, will then fill out a survey where they'll report, here are the types of duties I do on a daily basis. Here's the percentage of time I spend on each one of those duties, and we'll then report that in a survey. Then you'll oftentimes have somebody from the HR office who will then come on site and shadow this person as they are doing their job to confirm the types of work they're doing, the amount of supervisory responsibilities they have, the percentage of time they're spending on each one of these duties. HR will then confirm all this information that was provided in that survey. So this is a job analysis in which you are deconstructing each individual job into its component elements. Very similar to what we talked about with Frederick Taylor in scientific management. So we break the job up into its component elements. Once we've conducted a job analysis of each position within our organization, then we can use that information for the purpose of a job evaluation. And the difference here is with a job evaluation, we are now comparing between positions. So in a job analysis, we're looking at each individual position in isolation. In a job evaluation, we take the results of those job analyses and we then use that information to compare jobs to other jobs for the purpose of classifying those positions and then assigning appropriate compensation. So when you do these job evaluations, we're comparing position against position. We typically focus on elements of the job, such as the amount of skill required to perform well on that job, the amount of responsibility that comes with that job. So you look at supervisor responsibilities. Is this person responsible for 3 or 7 or 10 employees, or is there no one that this person is responsible for? The amount of effort that needs to be put in to do a good job in this position, and the work conditions under which this work is being done. So let me share out with you an example of some of those things in what's called a point factor job evaluation. So let me share that file out. And I have this up on our Canvas site, so you can go and review this at your leisure. But here is a point factor job evaluation method. So in a point factor job evaluation method, what you will do is you will identify the set of compensable, the factors that can be compensated. You identify a set of compensable factors that are identified as determining the worth of the job. So the idea here is that as a result of this point factor evaluation, you can then compare job A to job B. Job A, if it has more skill required, if it has more responsibilities, then it will probably be ranked higher on the point factor evaluation than job B, and will then occupy a higher place in the position classification system and then be awarded more compensation than position B would be awarded. So typically the compensable factors of a job include categories such as we said before, the amount of skill, responsibilities, work effort, and working conditions. So we oftentimes break those 4 categories down into more specific factors, such as in skill, you're looking at things like the experience that is required to do a good job in this position. How much experience is required? the type of education and how much education is required in order to be able to do this job, and skill ability levels. So, what types of specific skill levels are required to do a good job in this position? Responsibilities, we oftentimes break that down into fiscal and supervisory responsibilities. So, what types of fiscal responsibilities does this position carry with it? Is this a position that makes budget decisions? Is this a position that manages and creates a budget? If so, they'll probably rank relatively high in terms of fiscal responsibilities. Supervisory responsibilities, as we said before, what people are you managing? Are you supervising? How many people are you supervising? How many supervisory responsibilities do you have? Third factor is work effort. We look at mental as well as physical effort. So the amount of mental effort that's required in this job versus the amount of physical effort that's required in this job. If you're shoveling pig ore, there's a lot of physical effort that is involved in the job. If you're in a white collar management position, it's probably be a lot more mental types of effort required as opposed to physical. Then fourth, we'll look at the working conditions. So we'll look at where the work is being done, the location of the work. We'll look at how hazardous that work is. So how susceptible is the incumbent to risk of physical harm? So if you have someone who is a patrol officer, they have a much higher risk of physical harm than if you're looking at a police chief who works in the police department. So that would be a way in which we could compare those two different types of positions. And then extremes in the environment. How extreme are the environments in which someone is working? If you have someone who is working outside in very dangerous conditions on a freeway, doing highway construction and reconstruction, sometimes, especially in poor weather, that can be a very extreme environment in which they are working, which can also lead to a lot of these types of physical hazards, as compared to someone who's working in a climate controlled office every single day behind a desk. But the purpose here is we will deconstruct, we've already deconstructed jobs, and we'll take each of those deconstructed jobs, and then we'll look at the amount of skill, responsibilities, effort, and working conditions in each of those positions. Now, for each one of these four factors, what we will do is we will then assign a weight to each one of those factors. So we'll decide which of those factors is more important than the other factors. So perhaps skill might be worth 40% of the final score on this point factor evaluation. Maybe responsibility will be worth 20%. Effort will be worth 20%. Working conditions worth 20%. So we'll weight each one of these factors. We'll then assign a score to each one of these factors and multiply that score by the weight. Then we'll add up those resulting scores, and then that will then give us an overall score for that position. So if the police chief position scores a 40 and the patrol officer position scores a 15, then obviously we know the police chief position will be placed at a higher level on our classification system and compensated more than the patrol officer position. So the whole purpose here of a point factor evaluation is it provides us with the empirical quantitative data that we need to compare and differentiate between positions for the purpose of classification and eventual compensation as part of that classification system. So that's a very important function that we do in the evaluation part of human resource management. Now, point factor evaluation is not the only way you can do job evaluation, but it is by far the most common because it's the simplest and the quickest way to do a job evaluation. So in analysis, you have deconstructed individual positions in their component parts. You then take that information and you use it for your point factor job evaluation to compare position against position for the purpose of classification and compensation. Let's go back into our slides here and make that a little bit bigger for you. So once we've conducted this job evaluation, we now have the empirical information we need to then place these positions into our position classification system. So at the federal level, as a result of this point factor evaluation, one position may be a GS 13, another position would be a GS 11. GS 13s get compensated more than GS-11 positions. But also the job analysis and job evaluation can then also be used for the creation of a position description. And so most of you who work in a public agency, you probably have a position description for the position that you are currently occupying. That position description will list out for you, here are the types of duties that you do on a daily basis. Here's the percentage of time that you spend every day on each one of those duties. That's a traditional position description. But it's difficult to get at the creation of a position description unless you have already done job analysis, job evaluation, and classified your positions. So again, this is very much a building block approach. Job analysis done to then allow you the information you need to do a job evaluation, which then gives you the information you need for position classification, as well as the creation of a position description. There is an alternative to a traditional position description that just lists, here are the jobs, the tasks that are done on a daily basis, and here's the percentage of time spent on those tasks. And that variation is what's called an ROD, which stands for a results-oriented description. In a results-oriented description, what we do is we begin to incorporate performance expectations into the position description. So when the incumbent reads this description, they not only know what they're doing, they not only know how much time they're spending on those tasks, but they know what the performance expectations are in terms of the quality of the work that they are producing. So if you think about a very simple position, such as, let's say a clerical position. So someone who is working at the front desk of this office. In a traditional position description, you might just say this person greets visitors when they come in, this person answers phones, and this person refers visitors to the appropriate office. So those are the three primary functions of this front office receptionist type of position. That's a traditional description. In a results-oriented description, you will say they greet visitors, but then you'll have a performance expectation attached to that. So performance expectation could be they greet every visitor upon entry into the building. So you have to greet everyone and you have to greet them upon entry into the building. So if you're not greeting everyone, or if people are waiting to be greeted, obviously you're not fulfilling your performance expectation. In terms of answering phone calls, you may have a performance expectation that every call gets answered by the second ring, and there is a certain greeting that must be said every time that phone is answered, and that's done 100% of the time. That's the expectation for this position. Referring people to offices, that people are referred to the correct office 100% of the time, that's a performance expectation. So the nice thing about putting performance expectations into your position description is obviously your employee is then clued into what they are expected to do and how well they're expected to do it. The nice thing about a results-oriented description is that this results-oriented description can then serve as a great segue into performance evaluation. And it's important that we distinguish between job evaluation and performance evaluation. Job evaluation is a comparison of positions in our organization based upon the content of those positions. A performance evaluation looks at the actual performance and productivity of the individual who is occupying that position. But if people know what the performance expectations are ahead of time in their results-oriented description, then they're not going to be surprised if they get a performance evaluation that is lower than what they would have hoped for. Because if you're saying you have to greet 100% of guests upon entry into the building, if you know that you haven't done that, then you know why you're getting a somewhat negative performance evaluation 3 or 6 or 9 months down the line. So it's a really nice bridge into performance evaluation. The problem with performance evaluation in human resource management is that oftentimes no one wants to do it. Employees don't like to be evaluated because there's always that fear that they're going to get a negative evaluation. Most employees think they are doing an outstanding job. And so they always fear that when they get this evaluation, it's going to be lower than what they anticipated. So your employees fear oftentimes performance evaluation. Supervisors fear doing performance evaluations because of the high stakes that are involved. So when you do a performance evaluation for an employee, there are a lot of high stakes that are attached to it. And so your chances for promotion, your chances for participating in training and development or participating in a management training program, those could all be on the line with the results of this performance evaluation. And so one of the reasons why supervisors don't like doing it is this fear of playing God, having too much power over the lives of your employees. So when you have resistance both at the employee level as well as at the supervisory level, sometimes organizations try to avoid doing performance evaluation. But if we want to achieve our effectiveness and our efficiency and all of our other values in public administration, we need to have a good, integrated, ongoing system of performance evaluation. Now, how you do performance evaluation will depend upon the performance evaluation format that you select. One of the most common formats for performance evaluation is graphic rating. And we've all seen this graphic rating before. If you filled out a survey, you've probably done graphic rating. It's those like or no response categories of things like strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, disagree, strongly disagree. That's what's known as graphic rating. So you might have a prompt such as, the employee is punctual to work. Then the strongly agree, neither, disagree, or strongly disagree. The employee always completes projects on time. And again, that like or no response scale. That's one of the most commonly used performance evaluation formats because obviously it's easy. It's simple. It doesn't take you a long time as a supervisor to complete a graphic rating type of evaluation. The downside is that it doesn't provide a lot of formative feedback. So when we do performance evaluation, we oftentimes do it for two purposes. We do it to provide summative feedback, which would be like, how many strongly agrees or agrees did you get? It's a summation of your performance. But we also do it for formative purposes as well. So it can provide good substantive feedback to our employees so that they can use that feedback to then improve their performance. Graphic rating used alone oftentimes does not give us that formative aspect to performance evaluations. It is only summative in nature. A variation on graphic rating is what's called a forced choice approach. In a forced choice approach, you might have a prompt such as, the employee always, and then the forced choices are, arrives on time, always arrives on time at least 4 days per week, always arrives on time at least 3 days a week. And you have all these different choices that supervisors can select in response to that prompt. The problem with forced choice, obviously, if you don't include the right response categories, the right choices, then you're going to have measurement error. So if there is a supervisor who wants to have a response that's not on that forced choice list, they're going to force themselves, no pun intended, into one of the provided responses, which will then cause measurement error. A ranking approach is very easy and very useful if you're using it for compensation. So you want to decide, who gets this additional compensation. So we'll use a ranking approach. And we'll literally rank all the people all the incumbents' performance in this position classification from 1 through 30. And then obviously we know who's performing at the top level and who then warrants these additional perks of the job, whatever they may be. Problem obviously with the ranking approach is it's ordinal in nature. And so you may say, this is our top performer, this person's number 2, but there's really no measurement between number 1 and number 2. So number 1 may be far ahead of number 2, and then number 2 and 3 are very close to each other. But if you're just using ordinal ranking, you can't see the gradations between each one of those ranked categories. An essay approach is just what it sounds like. So we'll write a narrative essay, kind of a short answer essay in terms of each element of the performance of this employee. Nice thing there is it's very formative. You get a whole lot of hopefully constructive feedback that is given to the employee. The problem is that it is very subjective. And so if you have supervisors who write really well, then your evaluation is going to look a lot better than someone who has a supervisor who doesn't write quite as well. So there's a lot of subjectivity involved in essay. The final approach there is one that is probably preferred to these other approaches. That's what's known as a BARS approach, which stands for a behaviorally anchored rating scale. Behaviorally anchored rating scale. And a BARS approach is something very much akin to what you'll see on a syllabus, where in the syllabus you'll say, to earn an excellent grade on this essay, here are the behaviors you have to exhibit. To get a good evaluation on this essay, here are the behaviors you exhibit. To get an average, here are the behaviors, and so on and so on. So the scores are anchored to the specific behaviors that will then lead to the awarding of those scores. So again, on our Canvas page, I have an example of a BARS approach. I hope it's still on here. Looks like it has disappeared. So let me go ahead and share out my screen. I hope it's still on there. So let me share my screen and let me go ahead and stop this for now. Stop that share. Let's do this. Let me find it first. It's right here. Okay. So let me share that out for you. So here is a BARS type of approach, behaviorally anchored rating scale. It'll pop up in a second. It's still loading, and it should be there for you. Here's a behaviorally anchored rating scale type of approach. So number one, acceptance of supervision. So the incumbent willingly accepts and follows instructions given by supervisor in the performance of duties, responds to training and coaching in a constructive manner. So if you want the rating of meets expectations, here are the behaviors you can exhibit in order to get a meets expectations rating. Readily accepts and completes assigned responsibilities, attempts to improve performance following constructive criticism, follows policies set by supervisor without reminders, cooperates willingly with supervisor, follows specific instructions. Those are the types of behaviors that will get you a meet expectations. If you want exceeds expectations, demonstrates exceptional ability to independently complete assigned responsibilities. So now we're talking about working independently in order to complete those responsibilities. Never complains about assigned tasks, improves performance following constructive criticism, knows and follows all policies set by the supervisor. So if you're working independently, that independent work is what's going to bump you up from meeting expectations up to exceeding expectations. And then the dreaded does not meet expectations. Those are the behaviors, complains about tasks, fails to consistently follow all policies, and so on and so on. So that's for acceptance of supervision. Then another category could be adaptability and flexibility. So adapts readily to new situations and changes in the workplace, works well under pressure, learns and functions well under widely different situations and circumstances. To meet expectations, you readily adjust to new situations, easily handle a wide range of a variety of tasks, readily comprehend new job-related information, performs well under widely different and or changing circumstances. To exceed expectations, you function effectively under unusually high levels of mental or emotional stress. So we're adding that on as a behavior that would bump you up then to exceeding expectations. And they can, I'm not going to go through all of them. They can see all the rest of the possible behavioral examples. Change management is another area of evaluation here, same type of idea. Communication, same type of idea. Composure, stability, confidentiality, customer service, and so on and so on. If you scroll all the way down, you'll see that we've got a total in this example of 24 different elements of performance that are being evaluated with this behaviorally anchored rating scale. Obviously, the advantage here is you get both a summative evaluation as well as a formative evaluation. You get a summative evaluation in terms of exceeding, meeting expectations, or not meeting expectations. You get a formative information from these possible behavioral examples. So if you are not exhibiting one of those behaviors, then you're not terribly surprised if you're getting meets expectations as opposed to exceeds expectations. So I think the big moral of the story here, there are a couple of morals. One moral of the story is that the more transparent the evaluation is, the more likely it is that employees are going to accept the results of that evaluation. Also, the more employees are involved in the formulation of this evaluation process, the more likely they are to accept the results. It's very much like what Martha Durthick and Pressman Moldovsky kind of told us in their study of policy implementation. The more you involve the implementers, the more likely you are to have their buy-in and support. Well, the more likely you are to involve your employees, the more likely you are to have the buy-in and support of those employees in evaluation. The worst situation you can have in performance evaluation is the creation of this thing called cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance occurs when an employee believes that they are performing very, very well, and then they get a very negative performance evaluation. They will blame the supervisor, they'll blame the evaluation process, as opposed to looking inwardly at what they're doing on a daily basis and how they are performing their job. So once you involve people, once you make it a very transparent process, people are much more likely to accept the constructive criticism that comes out of these evaluations and then utilize that feedback in order to improve their performance and productivity. There is a very famous article by an author named Charles Fox many years ago that likened performance evaluation to being what he called the keystone of the human resource management process. And when you think about an arch, and it's an arch made out of all these blocks, the keystone of that arch is that block that is at the very top. It's at the very top of the arch, at the apex of the arch. That's what's known as the keystone. If you remove that keystone, the entire arch will collapse upon itself. He argues performance evaluation is that keystone. If you don't do a good job of performance evaluation, the entire human resource management process will collapse upon itself. And I think it's very true. I think performance evaluation is that important because not only is performance evaluation used in order to make decisions about who gets to go into management training programs or who gets to be recognized as employee of the month or whatever type of reward there is, it is also then used to make determinations about training and development. So if you have an employee who has a subpar performance evaluation, then in a career civil service system, it's then incumbent upon the supervisor to then afford that employee opportunities for training and development to mitigate that poor performance. So give them training and development opportunities so that they can further develop their skills in order to improve their performance. So in the process of human resource management in the public sector, you do performance evaluation, and then if there's subpar performance, you then provide training and development opportunities and you again evaluate performance. If the performance is again subpar, then you provide additional training opportunities. Then you evaluate performance again. If it's still subpar, you probably will again provide some training and development opportunities. It's a very long process that you need to go through to eventually get to your final function, which is sanctioning and discipline. But before we get there, it's also important to point out that these different categories of performance evaluation, graphic rating, forced choice, ranking, essay, and bars, they are not necessarily mutually exclusive. So sometimes you'll see a graphic rating combined together with an essay. Sometimes you'll see an additional essay component built into behaviorally anchored rating scales. So it's important to know that we do combine a lot of these approaches together into kind of hybrid evaluation formats. But the format will only get you so far. If you are not involving the employee in the development of this evaluation process so that they trust the process, they are never going to trust the constructive criticism that they are getting as a result of that process. You're going to create that cognitive dissonance, and then your evaluation process is simply not going to work. However, if you have documented multiple instances of subpar performance, and you've also documented multiple instances of providing training and development to address that subpar performance, once you've documented all that, if all that has failed and the performance is still subpar, then you can move into the fourth part of human resource management, which is discipline and sanctioning. A lot of people believe that you cannot terminate a career civil servant, and that's not true. You can terminate a career civil servant, but it must be for cause. So if a career civil servant is terminated, They have grievance processes, not just through the career civil service system, but they also have grievance processes probably through their union and through the collective bargaining agreement. So it's important to document, document, document. If you have all the documentation that is necessary to document subpar performance and then the offering of training and development to help the employee improve their performance, then eventually down the line, you may then be able to terminate that employee. And that termination then withstand the scrutiny of CalPERB here in California, or the scrutiny of the Merit Systems Protection Board at the federal level, and you can withstand that type of quasi-judicial scrutiny, as well as legal scrutiny as well, if it does make it into the court system. But it is important that we go through a process of documentation, much like what Max Weber told us. In a rational bureaucracy, we need to document all of our interactions with our employees throughout the entire performance evaluation process. As we had mentioned last week, I believe that because of all these steps we have to go through in human resource management, because of the limitations in which we work in terms of the career civil service system, and then overlaid on top of that collective bargaining agreements, the process of managing human resources has become very difficult and very complex. So much so that a lot of public agencies have really started to centralize human resource management within human resource management offices. So the HR office will handle a lot of these different aspects of human resource management as opposed to the line manager. That is something we've experienced here at the university. I know in our college, in the past, department chairs were the appropriate supervisor, as they call it here in the system, the appropriate supervisor for evaluations of staff members. Now that has been centralized in the college office. And so now there's an individual in the college office called the ASM, which is Account Services Manager. And the ASM is then has overall responsibility for the evaluation of employees within departments and within programs. The complication there is obviously the ASM is at the college level, so the ASM is much more remote from the employee. It doesn't see the employee's daily functions and daily performance as well as the department chair, but now it has been centralized to the college level into a human resource management professional. And I think that's kind of a common approach that we've seen in a lot of public agencies. So that centralization, the good thing about it for people who are looking for careers in public administration is that it's now created this explosion in the size of HR offices. So if you are a human resource management professional, there are a lot of additional opportunities for you in the public as well as the private sector that may not have existed 20 or 30 years ago. If you are interested in human resource management, again, you will take the 577 Human Resource Management course as a core course in the program, but you also have the ability to complete a certificate in employee-employer relations. And in that certificate in employer-employee relations, the core course that you would then add on to your studies would be PPA 575 Employee-Employer Relations. So if what you cover in 577 is still not specific enough to what you want to do as a human resource management professional, I would certainly recommend you think about the employee-employee relations certificate, because once you get into PPA 575, you will get into a lot of those granular details about how you manage human resources on a daily basis in public agencies. Again, this just kind of gives you a little bit of an overview of the human resource management function in public organizations. And again, since the vast majority of our budget goes toward managing human resources, it's important that we kind of know what we're doing in terms of managing these human resources in the public sector. Are there any basic questions or observations at this point in terms of the management of human resources? Okay. If not, since we're running a little bit ahead tonight, rather than take a break, let's go ahead and jump into management of fiscal resources, and then we'll end up taking our break in the course of this discussion, because it's a little early for a break now. So let's go ahead and delve into the management of fiscal resources and then go from there. So our final function that we are talking about in this class that public administrators do is they manage finances. As we've talked about many times in this class, one of the major differences between public service and private service is in public service, we are managing precious taxpayer dollars. So that places us as administrators in this, what we call fiduciary type of role. And in a fiduciary role, we are managing resources that do not belong to us. We are managing resources that belong to the public. So if you're in a private corporation and you're the president of a private corporation and you're the head of that corporation doesn't have shareholders. I mean, you own that corporation. Those are your resources. In the public sector, even if you're the head of a public agency or department, you're still not managing your own resources, you're managing public resources. So it really does raise the bar, if you will, in terms of the way in which we behave in managing these public resources. So we manage our public resources primarily through the creation and management of public budgets. I think we all have a pretty good idea of what a public budget is. A public budget is a very prospective document that in a public budget, we are saying, here is the amount of money that we're going to spend in the next fiscal year, and this is what we are going to spend that money on. So this amount of money is going to be spent on this amount of money is going to be spent on this, but it's a very prospective document because it looks at how we plan our spending our money or the public's money in the next fiscal year. And I think that's a pretty good basic definition of a budget. It's a prospective document of how we are going to spend public money in future year. I think that is a limited definition though, because when we really think about budgets, inherent within budgets is decision making. We are making decisions about which programs, which policies, which agencies should get funding versus which should not get funding. Which agencies should get an increase in their funding and how much of an increase should they get versus which agencies should not get an increase in their funding. So whenever you are putting a public budget together, you are making decisions about priorities. If we see education programs get a big uptick, a big increase in the amount of appropriations they get in a year, that means that we are prioritizing education in that given fiscal year. And so when you are prioritizing one program or one policy choice over another, it really kind of raises the stakes when you're looking at a public budget. So I would offer a second description or a second definition of a public budget as a public budget is a document that prioritizes the values of society. It's a statement of societal priorities. So it's a statement of what society is prioritizing at that given point in time. So when your budget is a statement of values or a statement of societal priorities, it really becomes much more important than if it was just a statement of dollars and cents. So I would challenge us tonight to think about a budget as a statement of societal priorities. Budgeting can be complicated because we are dealing with numbers, and we're dealing with numbers for a variety of different purposes. Typically at the state and the local level, we have two primary categories of budgets that we use: operating budgets and capital budgets. Operating budgets are used for the daily operations of our public organizations. So paying for salaries and benefits and supplies and maintenance costs. Those are our operating budgets. And then we have a second type of budget, the capital budget, that is used to pay for our capital improvement projects, these buildings and these fleets of vehicles, these very long lifespan, high price tag, non-recurring types of projects. Those get funded in our capital budget. And last week, we talked about decision-making models, or I don't know if it was 2 weeks ago, maybe, we talked about decision-making models. We talked about rational, comprehensive, and incrementalism. And the example I gave you is that an operating budget is based primarily on incrementalism. We look at how much money we spent on supplies last year. We make a small marginal incremental change to that, maybe 2 or 3% to keep up with the cost of living. And then that's how much we spend on it this year. It's a very small incremental type of process. Capital budgeting, we tend to use a much more rational process. And we are really taking the time and collecting the information necessary in order for us to really do a rational, comprehensive job of deciding, are we going to fund this $100 million recreation center, or are we going to fund this $80 million senior citizen center, or this $60 million aquatic center? These are very, very high price tag items. There are also items that are not going to recur every single year. They're going to be items, projects that are going to be used by multiple generations. So therefore, we want to take our time. We want to be as detailed and specific as we can be in deciding which of those capital projects to put within our capital budget. So most state and local governments will run a separate operating budget and a separate capital budget. However, at the federal level uses a unified budget where the federal government throws all their capital expenditures into a unified budget. And the primary reason why the federal government does that is when you look at the magnitude and the scope of the federal budget. The federal budget is so incredibly large that even if you put a $50 million capital project into the overall unified budget, it literally is just a drop in the bucket. It's like dropping a pebble into a lake. You don't really see the difference. You don't really feel the difference. However, if you're a small local government and you're going to dump a $50 million capital project into your operating budget, it's going to blow a hole in your budget. And you're never going to be able to balance revenues and expenditures. And for local governments and for state governments, they have a constitutional requirement to balance their budgets. They must balance revenues and expenditures. That would never happen if they didn't have a separate capital budget. The national government doesn't worry about balancing its budget. It runs huge deficits year after year after year, runs a ever increasing national debt. It doesn't really care about balancing its revenues and expenditures. So we see operating capital budgeting used at state and local level. We don't see capital budgets used necessarily at the national level. Our discussion tonight is going to focus primarily on operating budgets as opposed to capital budgets. And we're also going to start focusing on the national level of budgeting because that oftentimes serves as the template or the blueprint for how state and local governments will then do their budgeting as well. So in the budgeting process, regardless of whether we look at the national, state, or the local level, there are four basic phases in the budgeting process. The first phase is the preparation phase. The second phase is formulation. Third phase is execution. And the fourth phase is evaluation. So let's talk about each of those phases of the national budget process and talk about what goes on in each one of those phases to kind of serve as then a guide for how state and local governments do it. And we're not going to get too terribly specific here because you could design not only a class, you could design an entire master's program on the national budget process. It is so complicated, so detailed, and so convoluted that it's way beyond the scope of what we cover in this class to cover all the nuances. It's even beyond the scope of our PPA 555 class to cover all the nuances in the budget process. In fact, there are members of the Senate who have served in the Senate for decades. Mitch McConnell is an example. Mitch McConnell said that even though he had served in the Senate for decades, he still could not tell you every nuance and every detail in the national budgeting process because it was that convoluted and it was that complex and detailed. But just kind of from an overall 30,000-foot helicopter level, what happens in the preparation of the budget? Well, at the national level, the preparation phase will consist of producing our forecasts, our revenue forecasts, and our expenditure estimates. So two of the primary organizations that are involved in preparation at the national level are what's called the OMB, which is the Office of Management and Budget, and the CBO, which is the Congressional Budget Office. The Office of Management and Budget is the president's management arm over the federal budget. So what OMB will do is OMB will put together its revenue projections as well as its estimates for how much will it cost us next year to continue the same level of service that we had for this year, what it calls its current service estimates. So it'll produce all these forecasts, these projections, and these estimates. And then on the legislative side, we have this thing called the Congressional Budget Office. And the Congressional Budget Office essentially does a similar type of thing only for Congress. So OMB is for the president, CBO is for Congress. It's a legislative congressional organization. The interesting thing about OMB and CBO is they're both involved in revenue projections and expenditure estimates, but the methodologies that they use are oftentimes very different. So the projections that you get from OMB oftentimes will look a lot different than the projections that you'll get from the Congressional Budget Office because they use different assumptions. They'll use different what we call discount rates. And if you use different discount rates and different assumptions, the results you get in your projections are oftentimes going to be wildly different. OMB's revenue projections tend to be much higher than CBO's. OMB tends to be very, very optimistic in terms of forecasting the amount of revenue that the national government will generate. And the reason why they're so optimistic is because they serve the president. And so by being optimistic, they provide a little bit more wiggle room for the president to get their programs funded through Congress. And so OMB tends to be really the optimistic one. The corollary to these organizations in the California state budget process, the corollary to OMB here in California is the Department of Finance. The corollary to the CBO here in California is the Legislative Analyst Office, or the LAO. So they're not perfect corollaries, but the Department of Finance does a lot of the same things at the state level that OMB does at the national level. LAO does some of the same things CBO does, only here in the state of California. So in preparation, we're putting together these projections, we're putting together all these estimates. Then OMB is responsible to be the central clearinghouse for all of the budget requests that come in from the various agencies and departments across the federal government. They will put out a call for budget requests. It's what used to be known as Circular A22. You don't need to know that, but it used to be called Circular A22. And they will put out a budget request and say, agencies, departments, give us your budget requests for the next fiscal year. All the agencies and departments will then submit their budget requests to OMB. OMB will look at those budget requests, will usually reduce those budget requests, will make cuts to them, and then the modified reduced budget requests will then be assembled together into the president's executive budget. The president's executive budget should be assembled sometime in January or very early February before the president goes to Congress for the State of the Union. The Constitution requires that the president inform Congress from time to time about the State of the Union. That has come to be interpreted over the past several decades as every year the president will provide a State of the Union address laying out their priorities for the upcoming fiscal year, and oftentimes talking about their perceived successes. I believe we have the next State of the Union by President Biden coming up in the next few days. I think maybe on Thursday, but it's coming up very soon. So usually the executive budget is put together before the State of the Union. Then after the State of the Union address, which usually occurs in late January, very early February, it's a little late this year. The invite didn't come out until later, so it's not going to be until now, the first week of March. But once the State of the Union is done, then the executive budget is usually available to be transmitted to Congress in early February, usually by the first or the second week of February. Once the budget goes to Congress, we then transition from the preparation phase of budgeting into the second phase, which is called formulation. Formulation is when Congress looks at the president's budget and will then make changes to the president's budget and eventually will then pass out what we call appropriation bills, which essentially are the discretionary spending in the budget. And I'll talk about that in a second. But so from early February until September 30th, we are in the second phase known as formulation. So the way the process works today is when the president's budget gets delivered to Congress, the president's budget will go immediately to the budget committees. There's one budget committee in the House and there's one budget committee in the Senate. So the House and the Senate budget committees will receive the president's budget. And then the job of those budget committees is to then pass this thing known as a concurrent resolution on the budget. A concurrent resolution on the budget. And today, that concurrent resolution on the budget needs to be passed no later than April 15th. So it's not ironic that the same day the taxes are due, but that's the concurrent resolution on the budget. The purpose of this concurrent resolution is to place spending caps on all the different areas of spending. So here's the maximum amount of money we can spend on agriculture. Here's the maximum amount we can spend on health and human services. Here's the maximum we can spend on Department of Defense. So the whole purpose of this resolution is to impose some spending discipline upon Congress. So they have these hard caps that they cannot go above in the spending in each one of these policy areas. Then the process turns to the appropriations committees, and this is what requires a little bit of explanation. So there are two types of spending that goes on at the federal level. There's what's called discretionary spending, and there's what's called mandatory spending. Discretionary spending is spending that Congress has direct control over. So this is spending that Congress can decide we want to cut the spending on this program by 10%, and they can do it in the budgeting process because it's discretionary. It's at Congress's discretion. Then there's other spending in the budget, things like interest on the national debt, spending on entitlement programs that Congress does not have direct control over. That's referred to as mandatory spending. So Congress cannot decide to not pay the interest on the debt. They have to pay the interest on the debt. Congress has borrowed that money, Congress has to pay that debt off. So that's mandatory, it's beyond their discretion. Entitlement programs are eligibility-based programs. We talked a little bit about entitlement programs when we talked about program evaluation last week. An entitlement program is a program that people are legally eligible for if they meet certain eligibility requirements. So the only way Congress can reduce spending on things such as Social Security is by changing the eligibility requirements. If you're eligible for Social Security, you get Social Security benefits. So if we change the eligibility requirements, if we increase the retirement age to 70 or 75 years old, you make fewer people eligible, and therefore you're spending less on Social Security. That's considered to be mandatory spending. Discretionary spending goes through the appropriations process. And I don't know if you remember, but several weeks ago, when we talked about the Constitution, we talked about the appropriations clause that says that before Congress may spend money or take money from the Treasury, that money must first be appropriated. And we said appropriation means simply just saying this is how we are going to spend this money. That's an appropriation. So discretionary spending goes through the appropriations process and will wind up in what are called these 12 appropriation bills. So there'll be separate appropriation bills for defense and military spending. There'll be a separate appropriation bill for education spending. There'll be a separate appropriation bill for agriculture spending. But that's discretionary spending in these 12 appropriation bills. This is what Congress has struggled with. We are now in early March, and we're still having these stopgap pieces of legislation to try and keep the government open because there are still 6 appropriation bills that Congress has not passed. These appropriation bills are supposed to be passed no later than September 30th so that they can go to the president's desk for the president's signature by the beginning of the new fiscal year, which is October 1st. So these are all supposed to be done by September 30th. Today is March 4th. So we are several months behind, and we have still not passed 6 of these appropriation bills. But those are what we call appropriation bills coming out of the appropriations process for discretionary spending. So the House Appropriations Committee and the Senate Appropriations Committee will work on those 12 appropriation bills. Each one of those appropriation committees in the House and the Senate have 12 different subcommittees. Each subcommittee works on a different appropriations bill. So they'll have hearings and do markups of their appropriation bill. They'll then pass that up to the House Appropriations Committee. They'll do markups and they'll hold hearings on that bill. Then they'll eventually pass the bill out to the floor of the House. Same type of process goes on in the Senate. Problem is that when the appropriation bill comes out of the committees and goes to the House floor, it probably looks a lot different than the bill that goes to the Senate floor. We also know in our discussion of the Constitution that before a bill can go to the president for the president's signature, it must pass the House and the Senate in uniform version. So that's when we then have these conference committees to try and hammer out the details of these appropriation bills before they can then be passed and sent to the president. So the reason why we're still talking about a possible government shutdown today is that we still have those 6 appropriation bills that we have not passed. So we just keep doing these continuing resolutions. whereby we'll come to an agreement that will continue funding these 6 different areas of government for another week or another 2 weeks until we can get those appropriation bills passed. So I think March 22nd is our next drop dead date for getting these appropriation bills passed through Congress. So that's the formulation phase at the national level. So it runs from the beginning of February until September 30th. Here in California, the formulation phase runs from January, when the governor produces their budget to the state legislature, which is usually in January, through June 15th. And the state legislature has the responsibility for passing the state budget no later than June 15th, so it can be signed by the president by June 30th for the beginning of the new state fiscal year on July 1st. So the federal fiscal year begins on October 1st. The state fiscal year begins on July 1st. So we're in a different fiscal year calendar than the federal government. As you know, here in California, in May, a very important thing happens, and that's what's called the May revise. So here in California, we'll get a May revise sometime in the middle of May. And that May revise will then update all of our revenue and expenditure assumptions, which will then have to be incorporated into the budget process. So in the May revise, this is why a lot of local governments are scared about. This is why a lot of local governments are sending out intents to lay people off, to do reductions in force, because you have to do that by March 15th. So they're sending those out because they don't know what's going to come in this May revise. There's a good chance that since we have a systemic budget deficit of upwards of $40 to $50 billion, that the May revise is going to be very ugly. And so there'll be further cuts that will have to be made to the governor's budget proposal. But in that May revise, you then have a really good sense then of how much money you have as a state to then make those changes to the proposal by June 15th. The governor can then sign it by June 30th. So that's formulation here in California as compared to formulation at the national level. If everything works the way in which it's supposed to work at the national level, by October 1st, the president has signed all the appropriation bills and we have a budget in place, and we can then go out and start spending the money. So the execution phase, the spending of the money, begins on October 1st and runs through the following September 30th. At the state level, it begins on July 1st and runs through the following June 30th. In execution, this is where we are spending money in our agencies in the way in which that money was legally appropriated to be spent. So execution is the fiscal year actually spending the money. Then, once that fiscal year is over, we then move into evaluation. In evaluation, we go back and we audit, and we see how we spent the money. We look at how well we spent the money. We do these financial and legal audits. We do these performance and management-based audits, as we talked about last week, in order to make sure we're not only spending the money in the legally appropriated ways, but we're also spending the money in the most effective and efficient ways possible. So evaluation then occurs after the fiscal year has ended. What makes the process so complicated is you have these 4 different phases to the budgeting process. That means that the process in one fiscal year is going to overlap into the process of another fiscal year. So while you are in the execution, the spending of money in a given fiscal year, you will be in the evaluation process for the previous fiscal year, and you'll probably be in the formulation process for the next fiscal year, and you might be in the preparation phase for 2 fiscal years from now. So you've got basically 4 different fiscal years. They're all overlapping with each other, just in different phases of the budgeting process. So the reason why we do that is we do that because we need a lot of transparency. We have all these rules and regulations, so we can adhere to those rules and regulations in an open and transparent way, so people hopefully can see how their public taxpayer dollars are being spent. When you go on to 555, you'll talk a little bit more about the federal as well as the state budget process. It's become more and more difficult at the federal level to get a budget done because we have these very close margins in the House as well as in the Senate, and it's difficult to get a majority to agree to anything. And so that's why it's become more and more difficult every year to try and get the federal budget done on time. Here in California, it's much easier to get the budget done because we have these super majorities in the Assembly as well as in the Senate. As we had talked about, I think before, We have 32 members of the Senate that are Democrats, 8 members who are Republicans, 62 members in the Assembly that are Democrats, only 18 Republicans. Those are supermajorities. And so supermajorities make it much easier to pass legislation. Add into that a Democratic governor, you have unified government, makes it very easy oftentimes to get a budget done. The budget may look ugly and we maybe have a deficit, but it's much easier to get it done. We also had a constitutional provision a few years ago that made it possible to pass the budget here in California with a simple majority. In the past, under Prop 13, we had to have a 2/3 majority in the Assembly as well as the Senate to pass the budget to get it to the governor. Now you only need a simple majority. However, you still need a 2/3 majority if you want to increase taxes. So if you want to increase revenue through taxation, you still have to get a 2/3 majority. But again, Democrats have those 2/3 majorities in both the Assembly as well as in the California Senate. So that's kind of the budget preparation process and the 4 different phases in the process: preparation, formulation, execution, and then evaluation. However, what do budget formats look like? What do the actual budget documents themselves look like? And that's what we're going to pick up our discussion after the break. I've provided these examples for you on the Canvas site, so I'm not going to go through and show you each one of these examples here in class. You'll go through those examples in 555. What I'm going to do after the break is I'll just talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of each of these 4 different formats, and certain situations where you might want to use one format as compared to another. But let's go ahead and take our break. Let's take a break till 5:35. Come back at 5:35, and we'll talk about what budgets look like and the advantages and disadvantages to each of these 4 main budget formats. So take a break to 5:35, come on back, and we'll finish our discussion. Okay, 5:35, so welcome back, and let's finish up our discussion of the management of fiscal resources to get you ready then for your PPA 525 public budgeting course. So the next piece of the puzzle here is to talk a bit about what public budgets look like in different types of public budgets, otherwise known as budget formats. There are 4 primary budget formats that we typically see used here in the US. Some more likely to be used at the national level as compared to the state or the local level. Again, I have links on our Canvas site under this module to each examples of each of these 4 different types of formats. I don't want to spend the time tonight going through those examples. You can take a look at those on your own. You will spend time going through those examples when you get to 555. But the first type of budget that is by far the most traditional type of budget we use is a line item budget. And these are budgets I'm sure you have seen before. Oftentimes, line item budgets are referred to as object of expenditure budgets. So in a line item budget, we will then list, here's what we're spending the money on, and then here's how much money we are spending. So salaries, here's the amount being spent on salaries. Benefits, the amount to be spent on benefits. Supplies, the amount to be spent on supplies, and so on and so on. The nice thing about a line item traditional budget is it allows you to control your expenditures. And a really good way to create a frame of reference for this discussion of line item performance program and zero-based budgets is to use the work of a budgeting scholar by the name of Alan Schick. I'll put him in text chat. Alan Schick. And Alan Schick wrote an article several years ago where he talked about the use of different budget formats for different types of budgeting purposes. So Schick identified 3 primary purposes we can use a budget for. The first purpose is control. The second purpose is management. And the third purpose is planning. So Schick says when we use a budget for the purpose of control, we're using that document to try and control how much money we're spending and what we are spending that money on. We can also sometimes use a budget document to help better manage our organizations, to help us better assess how well we are spending these taxpayer dollars, how well we are spending them to help us accomplish the goals that we want to try and accomplish. In a budget format that emphasizes management, we're really trying to draw a linkage between here's the money we're spending, Here are the activities that we are spending that money on. Here are the goods and services, the outputs that are being created by those activities. And then here are the outcomes, the consequences of those goods and services for the citizens who are consuming those goods and services. So it provides you with the information you need to better manage your organization, to try and make your organization more effective and more efficient. Then the third purpose he calls planning. We use the budget document in order to plan the operations of our organization. So we can look at how all the different units and all the different elements within our organization work together to help us achieve our goals and our objectives. So a line item budget is really useful for the purpose of control. It allows us to control how much money we're spending and what we're spending that money on. The limitation with the line item budget is you only have that information. That's all the information you have. You don't know how well you're spending the money. You just know how you're spending the money and how much money you are spending. The advantage of a line item budget is it's very quick and it's very easy to do. You look at your budget from last year, and then through incremental decision making, you make a small, minor increase or decrease to the amount you spent last year, and then that becomes the budget for this current fiscal year. So line item budgeting is very simple, very easy to do. The problem, obviously, is that it doesn't provide us with the information we need to know how well we are spending that money. Still today, the majority of local governments will do their budgeting through a line item type of budget because it is so easy and so quick to do. The second budget format is what's called a performance-based budget. A performance-based budget allows us to use the budget document for the purpose of managing our organizations. So this performance-based budget, what we will do is we will link up our activities. We'll link up the money that we have with the activities that are being funded with that money, with the outputs, the goals and goods and services that are being created by those activities, and then the results, the outcomes of those outputs for our citizens, for our consumers. So it gives you this linkage between the money you are spending and then how well you are achieving your goals and your objectives. And that's called performance-based budgeting, used to help manage the operations of our organizations. You may see performance-based budgeting used at the local level of government. Performance-based budgeting became very popular at the local level in the 1950s in kind of what we called a classic approach to performance-based budgeting. Then that classic approach to performance-based budgeting kind of fell into disrepute for a few decades. And then the 1990s, it then came back again at the local level in kind of a revised performance-based budgeting. The classical approach to performance-based budgeting looked primarily at outputs, looked primarily at the activities that we were doing in order to create the goods and services we were creating, and kind of stopped there. The new performance-based budgeting goes beyond that and looks at the outcomes and kind of asks that, my favorite question, the so what question. So this organization is creating all these different goods and all these different services. Well, so what? How does consuming these goods and services help our citizens? And so you're really looking at the consequences, the outcomes of those goods and services that are being produced. That's what's known as performance-based budgeting. It gives us the information we need to better manage our organizations to see how well and how efficiently and effectively we are spending our money. Then the third budget format is what's called a program-based budget. And a program-based budget, Chick says, is used for the purpose of planning. It's a planning document. So a program-based budget, when you look at the example on our Canvas site, you'll see looks a lot different than a line item or performance-based budget. Line item and performance-based budgets are organized around units or departments. So in a line item performance-based budget, you might have the budget for the police department, the budget for the fire department, and those departmental budgets are separate from each other. In a program-based budget, you do not budget according to department, but instead you budget according to program. So in a program-based budget, you may have a program such as protection of persons and property. That's the program. Activities that are funded in the police department will contribute to the goals of protecting persons and property. but activities in the fire department will also contribute to that same program goal. So if those activities all contribute to the protection of persons and property, then those activities get budgeted together under that program as opposed to getting separated out into a separate department, police department and fire department budget. The nice thing about that is by organizing your expenditures by program, you can see how all the different parts of your organization and all the different activities you're funding are all working together to accomplish certain goals and certain objectives of your program. So it's a completely different way of formatting your budget. But it allows us to use that budget then as a planning tool because we can then plan out here are all of the activities that contribute to this same program goal. There's a process in program budgeting known as crosswalking. And in crosswalking, what you will do is you'll just create kind of a very simple matrix whereby along the top of that matrix, you will then list all the different program goals. And then on the left side, you'll then list all of your different expenditures. And then you'll see which expenditures contribute to which program goals. You just put an X in each one of those cells to show this expenditure is contributing to this goal. Then all the expenditures that contribute to the same program goal then all get budgeted together under that same program heading. That's called a program-based budget. You're not going to see a whole lot of program-based budget used at the local level. You may see it used in some states. Where you will see a program budget used is in the Department of Defense. Department of Defense first initiated program-based budgeting way back in 1965 and has been using a variation of it ever since. This is called program-based budgeting. Again, it's really good to use if you want to see how all the different parts of your organization are working together to accomplish your goals and objectives. Then your fourth budget format is called a zero-based budget. In a zero-based budget, we go back and re-justify why we are spending money on these different activities and on these different programs. So you go back and you re-justify the spending of money. In a line item performance or program-based budget, you're probably never going to take the time to go back and re-justify why are we spending this money the way we're spending it. In a zero-based budget, you do. So you go back and re-justify all of your spending. Zero-based budgets really do align well with this third function, the planning function of a budget. And the way in which zero-based budgets work is that they are a very decentralized way of putting together a budget. So what you do in zero-based budgeting, your first step is to look at the lowest level in your organization where budget decisions can be made. Those places where budget decisions can be made are referred to as the decision units within your organization. Each one of those decision units, and oftentimes they're at lower levels of your organization, each one of those decision units will then put together what are called a series of decision packages, different ways of spending money. And so, for instance, I think the example I provide you on the Canvas site looks at a library. And so one decision package will look at the provision of a bookmobile. So a bookmobile that goes out there in the community so you can go to the community members and they can sign books out in this bookmobile rather than having to actually physically come to the library branch. So it looks at different ways of funding that bookmobile. And so one alternative could be to fund the bookmobile at 100% of what it was funded at last year. Well, if you funded at 100% of what it was funded at last year, you can probably provide a pretty similar level of services with the bookmobile that you provided last year with a few small reductions because cost of living and cost of gas has gone up and salaries may have gone up. So you may serve a few less people spending 100% exactly what you spent last year, but you'll be kind of close to your current level of service delivery. Then another alternative could be to fund it at 90%, so a 10% cut from last year. Well, if you funded only 90% of what you funded at last year, you're probably going to serve a significantly smaller number of people. And so less people will be able to get access to these materials. Your circulation rates will go down. Those are the consequences of a 90% funding level. Then you may ask the question, why if we funded 110%, so a 10% increase over last year? Well, that means we're going to be able to serve X number more patrons. Our circulation rates are going to go up by a certain percentage. So here are all the positive consequences of funding it at 10% more than we funded it last year. And so those are what we call our decision packages. So at the decision unit level, they'll create maybe dozens, maybe even hundreds of different decision packages. They'll then rank and prioritize those different decision packages and then send those ranked decision packages up the organizational ladder until they get to the top of the organization. Then they get re-ranked and reprioritized at the top level. And then the highest ranked decision packages will then be assembled together into that organization's budget. Okay, the nice thing about zero-based budgeting is it forces us to go back and reconsider why are we spending this money on these types of activities. Another nice thing about zero-based budgeting is it involves a lot of people in the organization in the budgeting process. And if one thing we have learned over the past few weeks is the more you involve people in the formulation of something, the more likely they are to support it. So if they're involved in the formulation of this budget, then they're more likely to have buy-in into the implementation of the budget. The downside of zero-based budgeting is it takes a very long time and it creates a mountain of paperwork. If you're creating all these hundreds of decision packages, that's going to take a lot of time to weed through all those decision packages and compare one package to another. You're going to spend most of your time budgeting as opposed to doing the work of the organization. So usually when zero-based budgeting is used, it's used in what's called modified zero-based budgeting, whereby we will not subject the entire budget to a zero-based process, but we'll select maybe 20% of our budget. And then 20% of our budget is done through zero-based budgeting. The remaining 80% then gets done according to line item budgeting. Then the next year we'll select a different 20%, and then the next year a different 20%. So after 5 years, our entire budget has then been subjected to zero-based budgeting, just in a very gradual type of process, 20% at a time. You're not going to see a lot of zero-based budgeting at the local level. Where you will see zero-based budgeting, though, is at the state level. And states such as Virginia, Georgia, for a while, Indiana, use zero-based budgeting. So you will see it used at the state level, not so much at the local level. But again, when you get to your 525 class, you will talk about these 4 different budget formats, but they are used for a certain purpose. Line item budgeting is used if you want to control how much money you're spending and what you're spending the money on. Performance-based budgeting is used if you want to develop information to help you manage your organization and to help you see how well you are spending money. Program-based budgeting is used if you want to better plan out the operations of your organization. And zero-based budgeting also is used for that planning purpose, but oftentimes you don't have the time or the resources to do a complete zero-based budgeting process, so you modify it and only apply it to a certain portion of your budget each and every fiscal year. But again, at this point, if you're interested in those formats, they are available for you on our Canvas site, but you'll talk a lot more about them when you get to public budgeting and finance. So not all budgets are created equal, and there are different types or different formats of budgets that governments can choose from. But in order to spend money, we know that governments need to raise money. So they can only spend as much money as they are generating in revenue. So there are different sources of revenue that governments rely upon. Taxation is obviously a major source of revenue for many governments. And the 3 main types of taxation you'll talk about in budgeting: property taxes, income taxes, and sales taxes. Property taxes are what we refer to as an ability to pay type of tax, in that people pay those taxes based upon their ability to pay the tax. The ability to pay the tax is based upon the value of your property, the assessed value of your property. It's beyond the scope of this class to get into the nuances of property taxation, but if you own a home, you're very familiar with how property taxes work. Your parcel of property, your home, will have an assessed valuation. That is the value of your property that your tax liability will be calculated on. Property taxes, as an ability to pay type of tax, oftentimes tend to be relatively regressive, because we're going to calculate your tax liability based upon the value of your property, but you're going to pay your taxes probably out of your income. There can be a disconnect between the value of your property and your income. If you inherited property from a parent That property may have a value on it that does not correlate with your income level. Here in California, we have this thing called Proposition 13, which says that the assessed value of property will change whenever that property changes hands. So if you own your property for a long period of time and you don't make any major improvements to your property, the value of your property for taxation purposes can only increase by a maximum of 2% per year. So if you buy a house in 1975 for $50,000, then every year it can go up by 2% for the purposes of taxation. However, if you were to buy the same house in 2024, exact same home, and you pay $900,000 for that house, then the $900,000 will then become the assessed valuation of that property. So it leads to a violation of what we call horizontal equity, in that different people who have the same home could end up paying wildly different tax rates depending upon when they purchased that property. So it's kind of a unique system that we use here in California with Proposition 13, but that's the property tax. As we know, property taxes tend to be the primary domain of local governments, and this is where local governments traditionally would get a lot of their revenue from. Now, local governments here in California, after Proposition 13, get a smaller percentage of the revenue from property taxes than they used to. Then a second type of taxation is income taxes, taxes based upon the amount of income that you are generating. Again, this is an ability to pay type of tax, in that if you make more income, then you're at a higher tax bracket, and you pay more in income taxes than if you were in a tax bracket. At the national level, as well as at the state level, we have marginal graduated tax brackets, which means that you will not pay your entire income at the 32% rate, but up to a certain amount of income, you pay at the 10% rate, and then up to another certain amount of income, you may pay at the 15% rate. Then the next level, you pay up to 24%, and so on and so on. It's meant to make the income tax fairer, and also has made the income tax a much preferred tax as compared to the property tax. Income taxes are relied upon by the national government as well as by state governments. Here in California, we do not have local income taxes. However, many other states do allow their local governments to charge income taxes to their residents. And then you have sales taxes. Sales taxes are consumption-based taxes. They are a benefits received type of tax. So as opposed to being ability to pay, they're benefits received. You pay the sales tax based upon the value of the commodity that you are consuming. So sales taxes are rolled into the price of a good. You don't pay your sales tax based upon how much income you make. You pay it based upon what you are consuming and the volume that you are consuming of that commodity. Sales taxes, for that reason, can be very regressive, in that they can have a much more profound impact upon lower income residents as opposed to upper income residents. Lower income residents tend to have less disposable income than upper income residents. Lower income residents have less disposable income because once they purchase all the staples of life, food and shelter and clothing, they have less money available for other things as compared to their upper income counterparts. So unless you exempt some of those staples of life from your sales tax is going to be very regressive. Is going to have a very negative impact upon your lower wage earners. Sales taxes are relied upon primarily by state governments as well as local governments that have access to what's called a local option sales tax in local governments here in California. But those are the types of tax-based sources of revenue that you're going to learn about when you get to your 555 course. But one thing we do need to recognize is that, at least here in the state of California, local governments have turned much more to non-tax sources of revenue. Non-tax sources of revenue, things such as user charges and user fees. User charges are charges that are applied for the consumption, the benefit you get from consuming some type of a service. So your trash collection, you're getting your trash collected. You are then charged for your trash collection that you are getting collected on a weekly basis. You're probably charged on a monthly basis. That's a user charge. Utilities, the amount of electricity that you use. You will get charged based upon the amount of electricity that you are using. You are being charged for the benefit of getting this type of a service. Then there are what are called user fees. User fees are usually not attached to some type of a benefit for a service. User fees are usually more attached to the benefit of engaging in a certain type of activity. So you want to drive your car. You have to register that car to drive it on the roads, and you have to then pay a registration fee for the privilege of driving on the roads. You get a driver's license. You have to pay a driver's license fee for the privilege of driving on a road. You want to fish, you have to get a fishing license for the privilege of fishing. You want to hunt, you have to get a hunting license, and so on and so on. If you want to open a franchise in a jurisdiction, you're probably going to have to get a license, and you'll then have to pay a franchise fee for the privilege of opening that restaurant or whatever franchise that is within that jurisdiction. User charges and user fees, those terms are oftentimes used interchangeably by local governments, but they are different in that charges are attached to the consumption of a service. Fees are usually attached to some type of a license that is granted for participating in some type of an activity. In the wake of Proposition 13, which limited the amount of property tax revenue that local governments could generate, a lot of local governments shifted away from property taxes and shifted more to non-tax revenue sources like user charges and user fees. So much so that the typical average city here in California generates a higher percentage of revenue from user charges and user fees than it does from the property tax. And that's your average typical city in California. Now, cities in Southern California are a little bit different. And if you look at the tax structure in your city, you may see that still pretty heavily reliant upon the property tax. But statewide, the shift has really been toward more of these non-tax types of revenue sources. The nice thing about a non-tax revenue source, especially a user fee, is it's not a tax. So people can shift the burden onto someone else. So if I don't hunt and I don't fish, I'm not going to get those licenses. And so therefore, I don't have to pay those fees. So I'm shifting that burden onto people who do hunt and people who do fish. But those are some of the major revenue sources that public organizations get their revenue from. Obviously, you need to have adequate revenue to pay your expenditures. If you don't have enough revenue to pay your expenditures, then you end up with this thing called a deficit. A deficit is an imbalance between revenues and expenditures in a given fiscal year. Deficits have been a major problem for many governments, especially the federal government, over the past several decades. The national government has run a national deficit every single year since 1969, with the exception of 2 years, fiscal year 2000 and 2001. Then the terrorist attacks of 9/11 happened, and then we had the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then our expenditures shot up, and we're back into deficit spending again, and we've been there ever since. But a deficit is an imbalance between revenues and expenditures in one given fiscal year. That is different than debt. Debt is long term. So if you want to construct a city hall, you borrow money that you'll pay back over 30 years. That's considered to be debt. You have run 30 years of deficits. All those deficits then add up into your long-term debt. But debt is much more long-term in nature. Deficit is an imbalance in one given fiscal year. But for our purposes and the purposes of our final assessment, whenever local governments want to construct these capital projects, typically they don't have enough money in hand to go ahead and construct those projects in year one. So instead, they have to borrow money. When local governments borrow money, they do it through the issuing of these things called bonds. Bonds are just when local governments borrow money. Bonds, there are different types of bonds that are available to local governments that you will cover in your 555 class. But just for our tip of the iceberg type of example here, three of the major types of bonds that tend to be used by local governments are what are called general obligation bonds, revenue bonds, and double barrel bonds. So in a general obligation bond, what a local government will do is it will borrow money, so it will issue a bond. Investors will then purchase that bond. And then the revenue that comes from investors purchasing that bond, that's the revenue that becomes the bond proceeds that are then used for the construction of the project. Then the government will pay off these investors over a 20 or 25 or 30 or sometimes even 40-year period of time with interest. So the benefit to the investors is they get their money back, plus they get interest, and their money is probably not going to be lost because government securities, government bonds tend to be relatively safe types of investments. So you get your money back in interest, and you also have a safe investment. So it's kind of almost a savings mechanism for investors when they purchase these types of government bonds. But the general obligation bond has been traditionally the most common type of bond that local governments have used. Not quite as popular today as it used to be, but in a general obligation or a GO bond, what a government will do is it will borrow money from investors, and then it will promise these investors that they will get their money back with all the resources of the city. So the city will say, we will use any resources at our disposal, anything we have to use in order to repay this debt. So if we have to lay off employees to free up money to repay the debt, we'll do that. If we need to sell property to repay the debt, we will do that. We will do anything we need to do, use all the resources at our disposal. That's why these bonds are referred to as general obligation bonds. The nice thing about a general obligation bond for a government is that they tend to be a lot cheaper to issue because they're very secure debts. If you're an investor and you're thinking about investing in something, there is very much this balance between risk and reward. So the lower the risk, the lower the reward, the higher the risk, the higher the reward. This is a very low risk investment. And so therefore the interest rates, what we call coupon rates, that are paid to the investors tend to be relatively low. So the general obligation bonds tend to be the least expensive type of debt that governments can issue. However, there are some problems with general obligation bonds. One problem with a general obligation bond is that states oftentimes impose limitations on the amount of general obligation bonds a local government can issue. So sometimes you'll be bumping up against your general obligation, what's called debt capacity. And if you don't have any more capacity left to issue general obligation bonds, you're simply not going to be able to do it. Also, these general obligation bonds are really very much of a promise to investors that, come heck or high water, as they say, you will get your money back. So we will pay you your money back, regardless of what resources we have to tap into in order to do so. So it's really sometimes a dangerous type of grant or guarantee that you are giving to investors. And then the third problem with general obligation bonds is you oftentimes have to get voter approval. And in some states, like here in California, you oftentimes have to get a 2/3 voter approval. You have to get 67% of your voters in order to pass a general obligation bond. Now, if you're a school district, you can get away with 55% voter approval, but it's still a supermajority. So it can be difficult for you to pass these bonds through your voters. Those are called general obligation bonds. A variation on a general obligation bond is what's called a revenue bond. Revenue bonds, the repayment to investors, that repayment is secured from the revenue generated from operating the facility. So if you're going to construct a recreation center and you're going to charge people a fee or a membership due, you collect those membership fees after the revenue generated by the facility. If the amount of revenue that you are collecting is enough to not only pay your operating costs, but also to repay the debt, then you can issue a revenue bond, but only if you have enough revenue from the facility, because the only repayment can come from the revenue from the facility. If this facility goes belly up and goes out of business, then the investor is out of luck, and then they don't get their money repaid. So there's a lot more risk for an investor with a revenue bond, which means if there's more risk, they expect more reward. So the interest rates are much higher that you have to pay as a government with a revenue bond than they are with a general obligation bond. But those are what are called revenue bonds. Again, they have become somewhat popular, but only for facilities that generate enough revenue that will then cover repaying the principal and interest payments on the debt. Then, and the nice thing about revenue bonds, one of the nice things is that they are not subject to general obligation debt limitations. So if you can't issue a general obligation bond, you may have to try and think of something more like a revenue bond. And then there's a middle ground between the two, which is a double barrel bond. Part of the issue will be general obligation, part of the issue will be revenue. So if your facility is not generating enough revenue in order to pay off a revenue bond, but it is still generating, you've got a net profit coming from that facility, then part of the issue could be revenue and paid off with that net profit. And then the rest of the issue, general obligation, and paid off with the general tax revenue that's coming in from the city. Nice thing about double barrel bonds is in terms of interest rates, they kind of fall in between general obligation and revenue. Interest rates will be more expensive than a general obligation bond, but they'll be cheaper than a revenue bond. So those are three basic examples of bonds. There are a lot of other types of bonds. There are zero coupon bonds and capital appreciation bonds and lease rental bonds and leaseback bonds and lease saleback bonds, and you name it. Governments have really been very creative in coming up with all these different types of bond designs, but these still exist as the three primary types of bonds that local governments use. And these are bonds that are used for long-term projects, which means they're going to be repaid over a period of time longer than just 1 year. The repayment time is probably going to be 20, 25, 30 years. If instead a government wants to borrow money for a short period of time, pay it back in less than a year, then they'll issue short-term debt, and that short-term debt is referred to as a note. So short-term debt less than 1 year is a note. Long-term debt more than 1 year in maturity is referred to as a bond. And you will again learn a lot more about debt when you get to your 555 course. But for the purposes of our final assessment, when you're looking at that debt scenario, you want to ask yourself the question, how much revenue does this facility generate compared to the amount of expenditures? And is it generating enough revenue beyond its expenditures in order to be able to repay a 30-year, however many $1 million debt? And if so, then you can use a revenue bond. If not, you're going to have to use something like a general obligation or perhaps a double barrel type of bond. But local governments borrow money, state governments borrow money all the time. And we borrow money primarily, hopefully, for the purpose of paying for these capital projects. If you are borrowing money to offset a deficit in a given fiscal year, that obviously is going to be a problem. And that's a sign of some pretty poor fiscal health in that city. Some cities do that because constitutionally, they are not allowed to operate at a deficit. They have to somehow find a way to increase their revenues to at least match their level of expenditures. And sometimes they'll do that through borrowing money. And in 525, you'll learn about all different types of notes, bands and TANs and RANs and all those types of things that can be used as short-term borrowing mechanisms. One thing we have learned about the budgeting process, especially at the federal level, is that the budgeting process is really out of control. And it's out of control in a couple of different ways. One way it's out of control is in our inability at the federal level to get budgets done on time. We simply do not get appropriation bills, all of them passed by September 30th. That just does not happen. So we can't get the budget done on time, and we also cannot bring the budget in balanced. That our budgets are never balanced. We always run deficits. Our revenues are always less than our expenditures. And so in both of those ways, we have an out of control federal budgeting process. We have tried many times in order to try and reform the budget process to either try and get budgets done quicker and or to try and eliminate deficits. And each time we've had some success, but more failures than successes. And in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, we tried 3 different times in order to reform the budget process to get it done on time and to eliminate deficits. In the 1970s, it was called the Budget and Impoundment Control Act. And it's beyond our scope here to get into all the details of the Budget and Impoundment Control Act. But the primary purpose of the Budget and Impoundment Control Act was to create a centralized budget formulation process in Congress through the creation of House and Senate budget committees. So the budget had a place to go when it arrived in Congress from the White House. Also, it was an attempt to try and enhance the power of Congress in the budget process. Congress felt that the president had become too powerful. So Congress wanted to provide some tools for itself in the budgeting process. This is where that Congressional Budget Office we talked about earlier, this is where the Congressional Budget Office was created. They also tried to limit the ability of the president to refuse to spend money in appropriation bills. So it tried to elevate Congress and its power in the budgeting process. However, after the Budget Impoundment Control Act, we still were not getting budgets done on time, number one, and we were still running deficits, number two. So those two problems were still unsolved, even though a lot of the things created in the Budget Impoundment Control Act still are in our current federal budget process. So in the 1980s, we decided to focus primarily on deficits. And so you ended up getting two pieces of legislation called Graham-Rudman-Hollings 1 and 2. And the three gentlemen on the screen are the co-authors, Phil Graham and Warren Rudman in the middle, and Fritz Hollings on the right. Phil Graham was a Republican from Texas. Warren Rudman was what became an independent. And Fritz Hollings was a Democrat from South Carolina, which we don't see a lot of Democrats from South Carolina anymore, but he was a Democrat from South Carolina. So it was a bipartisan piece of legislation to establish limitations on the amount of deficits we could have each fiscal year, and to create a timetable so that each fiscal year, those deficit targets would then decrease. So that after a number of years, the deficit target would then be zero, and we'll have eliminated deficits and we'll have balanced revenues and expenditures. Primary problem with this attempt is that Congress just ignored it. So Congress could just increase those deficit targets. If it saw it was not going to meet a target, it simply increased that target in that fiscal year. So we still, after Graham-Rudman-Hollings 1 and 2, we were still running deficits and not getting our budgets done on time. 1990s gave us this thing called the Budget Enforcement Act. In the Budget Enforcement Act, we tried to impose some fiscal discipline by separating spending into different categories. So said we'll have one category for domestic, one category for international, one category for defense. So three different categories of spending. And then we established walls between those different categories, meaning that if you wanted to kind of spend more on domestic programs, you couldn't rob from international to spend more on domestic. You had to find a reduction in domestic programs in order to pay for a new domestic program. So you couldn't rob from one category to pay for an increase in the other category. And it also created something that we on occasion still deal with today, known as PAYGO. PAYGO is an acronym that kind of stands for pay as you go, something that we are familiar with in our current lives. That, in our personal lives, we basically pay for things as we go. So PAYGO required Congress, if Congress wanted to start a new program, it had to pay for that through the elimination of another program. You have to pay as you go. We still see PAYGO used now and then in the Senate, not so much in the House, but we do see it used in the Senate. But again, we are still running deficits. But the Budget Enforcement Act throughout the 1990s really helped us kind of get rid of deficits, at least for 2 years. But we're right back into deficits again. In order to avoid deficits, the moral of the story is that we need to have the political willpower to spend less money and to raise more revenue. Excuse me. Excuse me. So the future of public budgeting is really much going to be a future of empty pockets. We see that here in California with our projected budget deficit. We see it at the federal level with ever increasing budget deficits. For state and local governments, one of the problems that we are encountering now is that the COVID money is gone. The COVID money is spent. We're not getting any more COVID money. And so that big influx of revenue to help kind of mask some of the fiscal impacts of COVID, that money is now gone. So a lot of the scars, economic scars from COVID on state and local economies, we're really starting to see now because we don't have the Band-Aid of federal money. And so that's why I think you see a lot of local governments are very concerned about having to do reductions in force. State governments looking at a $50 billion or so deficit, and that's probably the good case scenario. It may be even worse when we get into the May revise in the middle of May. So the future of budgeting is certainly going to be a very difficult future in terms of the availability of funds. But the management of fiscal resources is obviously one of the most important functions that we engage in as public administrators. You will learn a lot more about public budgeting and some of the nuances when you get to your 555 course, but at least here you've kind of had a foreshadowing of some of the information that you'll get in public budgeting. But it is one of our primary things that we do as public administrators. But to kind of wrap up this entire show, let's take a look at the future of public administrator, the future of the public sector, and talk about some of the challenges as well as some of the opportunities that we face in the future of public administration. Some of the challenges, we've already mentioned the first one, and that's going to be fewer resources. As COVID money goes away, there will be fewer resources for us to rely upon. And we're going to continue to be asked to do more with less, to produce more outputs, to produce better outcomes, but to do it with fewer resources. A second challenge in the public sector in the future will be the need for more direct contact between public administrators and citizens. The movement continues to be a movement to more openness and transparency, not only here in California, but across the entire country. That's a good thing, obviously. And it's a good thing to promote democratic participation, as ASPA tells us. It's a good thing to promote participation on the part of our citizens. But once you have citizens becoming more and more participants in decision making and policy making, that will introduce some challenges for public administrators. And we're seeing some of those challenges in terms of the resources that are being used for public records requests, some of the resources being used to respond to challenges to actions of boards and actions of city councils pursuant to the Brown Act. And so I think this will continue to take up more public resources to respond to some of these challenges that come from these avenues for public participation. I also think a challenge that we're going to see in public administration is less political support, less support from political parties, less support from elected officials. As elected officials become more of these free agents, as you have more and more candidates who can fund their own campaigns, they are less attached to what we call the moorings of the political party, and that they have not necessarily come up through the party apparatus, but they have been able to enter public life laterally because they have the resources to do so. So the more free agents you have as elected officials who are the overseers of the public bureaucracy, probably the less political support you're going to have from those elected officials, and the more demands those elected officials are going to be putting upon you. And so you'll probably have a lot less political support coming from those elected officials and those political parties. But I think one of the major challenges we're going to be dealing with in the future of public sector is this plethora of information. All this information that is out there that we now have access to and that citizens have access to, we need to work very hard to be conscientious and informed consumers of that information. We need to make sure that the information we are using in policy formulation and in implementing policies and programs, that that information is verifiable information, that information is based upon sound logic and sound research methods. The problem is there are so many new sources of information, including social media, and a lot of that information is unvetted information. So not only do we need to be conscientious consumers, but we have to help our citizens understand how to be conscientious consumers of that information as well. But everything is not negative. There are some opportunities in the future for the public sector. One opportunity is the increasing in technology, this kind of push and pull of technology. And so I think artificial intelligence, as I told you before, it can be a wonderful resource for public organizations. What we have to do is we have to understand how to leverage things like artificial intelligence and generative AI to make sure we know how to use it in order to do our jobs in a more effective, more efficient manner, and to better serve our citizens. So technology can really be a great opportunity if we know how to leverage it and if we are willing to leverage that technology. Today, we have over 150 years of study of public administration. We went through the development of the theoretical perspectives in public administration. We have learned from that evolution of that understanding. So we have a better understanding of public problems. We have a better understanding and a better access to possible solutions to those problems that have been developed over the past 150 years. So we need to understand what the literature tells us. We need to understand what we know about public administration, and then use that information to address current new problems. Judicial influence. Now, here is one that kind of can cut both ways. The judiciary has become much more involved in bureaucratic decision making, and that can be a positive or that can be a negative. The positive of judicial influence is that it gives us better protection of individual rights. It hopefully will give us better achievement of social equity and social justice. The possible downside of judicial influence is when we end up getting these things called writs of mandamus, when a court will come in and order a public official, order a public organization to take a certain type of action under threat of criminal or civil penalty. Those types of writs are oftentimes referred to as structural remedies, where the court will come in and say, you need to take this action to remedy this problem. So judicial influence can be good, but it also can be a negative in that it can take away and erode some bureaucratic decision-making power. But I think you're going to see more and more activism on the part of courts, especially activism looking at decisions and actions taken by public administrators. We have seen that with the idea of qualified immunity. And we have seen courts kind of claw back some of that qualified immunity that public administrators used to have. One of the questions with qualified immunity is oftentimes how much time did the public administrator have, whether it be a law enforcement official or someone working in a public agency, how much time did they have to think about the constitutional rights of this individual to make sure not to violate the constitutional rights? So is this something that had to be done in the moment where they only had seconds to consider it? Or did they have days and weeks and months to think about the constitutional rights and then still went and violated those constitutional rights? So the sand is really shifting in terms of this idea of qualified immunity. And there's a case right now that is before the Supreme Court called the Gonzalez case, and that could have a very big impact upon the future of qualified immunity. And that's just an example of the influence the judiciary will continue to have on public administrators. But I think the real opportunity that we have before us in the public sector is we have more opportunities for cooperation and collaboration, whether it be collaboration between public agencies, collaboration between public and nonprofit entities, public-private partnerships. A lot of our programs today are being implemented and delivered by these collaborative types of relationships. So it's not just one agency delivering one program. Now it's multiple organizations coming together to kind of leverage the best of both worlds to the most efficient and effective job of delivering these types of services. So I think there's going to be much more collaboration, much more of a need for governing networks, and much more of an understanding of how agencies interact with their external environment and other organizations in their external environment, which means probably a rebirth of systems theory, especially open systems theory, as we learned when we talked about the evolution of theoretical perspectives in public administration. So just like with everything else, I think there is good and there is bad in terms of the future of the public sector and public administration. But hopefully the information we have covered in this course will give you a good, solid foundation for then moving into your future courses in the MPA program and understanding a little bit more about some of the functions and some of the roles and responsibilities that we have as public administrators, as well as the nature of public administration itself and how public administration and the study of public administration is in some ways very much different than the way in which we study organizations in the private sector. And that is all that I have. We've covered all the information we typically cover in a 500 course, and we've done it with 15 minutes to spare, which is actually pretty good compared to some previous semesters. So do you have any questions or any observations or anything about any of the information we've covered here in the second half of class tonight, the management of fiscal resources, or any of these trends in the future of public administration? At this point, you now have all the information that you need to cover all 5 of those scenarios on the final assessment. And so you should have everything you need in order to do an outstanding job on that final assessment. The midterm assessment scores were kind of off the chart. They were all very good, all in the A's and the very high B levels. So I anticipate that you'll do very well in the final. You know kind of the ground rules from the midterm. So the way in which you approach those questions on the midterm, approach them the same way on the final assessment. And I think everyone will do quite well. If you haven't submitted your Canvas essay number 5 yet, please do that by midnight. And then the final assessment, please submit that by midnight next Monday. Like I said, next Monday, we won't need to have a live Zoom session, but I will be available between 4 and 6:45. So if you have any questions as you're working on that final assessment, feel free to send me an email any day. And if you're working on it on Monday, I'll be in front of my computer to get you an immediate response to any questions as you put those final finishing touches on your final assessment. Okay. Anything else before we call it an evening? Okay. Well, thank you very much. Again, welcome to the MPA program. I hope this course has been helpful at getting you ready for the rest of the program. Any questions about anything at all course related, MPA program related, feel free to send me an email. I am always around and happy to answer any questions you have. So thanks, everyone. Pleasure working with you. I look forward to reading your final assessment. So have a great week and good luck in the rest of the program.